This module will discuss the social neuroscience of self-perception, and self-awareness. It's an introduction to the brain processes that afford an individual human the ability to be aware of his beliefs, thoughts, desires, his actions, the things he does, and even the way he appears to other people. A brief outline of this module shows us that we will first discuss the issue of self as an emergent property, and this will harken back to the notion of emergent property that we talked about in relationship to the mind emerging from the interaction of the brain with the environment. We'll then discuss multiple representations of self, the idea that the self is not just a single kind of concept, but there are many different cognitive brain processes that go into representing ourselves. We'll then discuss a set of brain regions that are important for self-understanding and self-representation, and they're known as the default network. And we'll also look at mirror neurons and how they might be related to self-processing. So for the first point in the outline, the notion that self is an emergent property of the interaction of the brain with the environment, as I said, we discussed a similar concept previously, and we even referred to the same analogy here, where the question of where in the car is transportation. Point to whichever part of that car it is that is the transportation. But we discussed how it's not the engine, it's not the wheels, it's not the steering wheel. Rather, all of those things have to be working together. They have to be hooked up together in just the right way. And if you then set that out on a road, then you've got transportation. Same thing is happening with the self and the brain. The brain is not, or the self is not one specific brain region. It's not even a specific set of brain regions. What it is are several brain regions that are interacting with the world. And through that interaction, the self emerges. These brain regions are ones that are doing things like representing the self and thinking about the way the self appears to others and so forth. And if you take those brain regions, hook them up in just the right way, you bring them input in the form of sensation, vision and hearing and stuff of that nature, and you also give it the ability to manipulate the environment through motor output, the motor system, then when you hook those brain regions up to the world in that way, the emergent property you get is a self-aware being, one that can be aware that it is an individual that is different from other individuals. So we will continue discussing this for the remainder of this module. Now we can begin discussing the second point in our outline, and that is the idea that the brain generates multiple representations of self. Now, this may seem a little bit confusing at first, but the idea is that there's no such thing as just the self, but rather there are many different functions that the brain performs, and when we bring all of these functions together, what we have is the concept of a self. So what are some of these different functions? This figure you see here actually comes from a review article in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences, and it lays out just a few different components of self. There are probably more than this, but these are at least, what do we have here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So these are at least 12 sub-operations subserving the generation of the self by the brain. So what do we have? We have notion of representation, that is the matter of labeling stimuli as self-referential. For instance, that's my car or my house versus his car and his house. There's the notion of monitoring, that is kind of being on the constant lookout for things in the world that are referential to you, that are important to you. You can evaluate those stimuli. Are they really particularly good for me? Are they really mine? Do I deserve to have them? And we have others here like self-awareness, unity, mind reading, which is really just this kind of gets you back to mirror neurons, covert mimicking of other people's mental states, emotion, autobiographical memory, memories about your own life, and there's so many different aspects of the self that we really need even an integration function. That is the process by which we try and bring all these different functions related to the self together so that we have some kind of unified sense of who we are. So when I talk about the self being an emergent property, that in reality what you have are a bunch of different brain processes that all, when they're hooked up to the world in the right way, they all come together to generate this concept of self. This is what I'm referring to. We have so many different aspects of the self that need to be tied together. So let's tie some brain regions to some of those functions. And the functions that we'll talk about here are the ones that I underlined in the previous slide. The first is representation. That is this idea of representing stimuli that are self-referential, things that are relevant to you. And there's some evidence from brain imaging studies that orbitomedial frontal cortex is responsible, or at least in partly responsible, for this process. And this is the region we see colored in red here toward the front of the brain. Orbito, here orbit just means like the orbits of the eyes. So if you're dealing with orbital brain regions, then you're dealing with ones that are near the eye sockets. And so this orbitomedial prefrontal cortex appears to become very active when we view stimuli that are important to us, and it's less active when we're seeing things that aren't so important to us. Now, we can also we have to kind of monitor the world to see whether these things are out there. Self-referential stimuli. So we see the blue area, anterior cingulate, here is apparently quite good at determining when there might be something out there that we need to consider, that we need to represent. And then there's a question of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, a lion would, out in the jungle, if you're out in the jungle, would be self-referential, be important to you, but it would be, of course, a very bad thing, something to avoid, as opposed to food that you might want to obtain, which would be evaluated as good. And then and so that appears that it's in part performed by the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, here in yellow. And then we also discussed the notion of integration, that we have to bring all these different aspects of the self together into a unified concept of the self, and that might be performed by the posterior cingulate region, giving us an integration of the different aspects of the self. In the previous lecture, what we did was start with a list of cognitive functions that likely subserve the processing of the self. That is, cognitive functions that enable a sense of self. And we went from that list of functions to some brain regions that might be performing some of those functions. Now I'd like to talk about a bit of research that went in just the opposite direction. Instead of starting with cognitive operations that make up the self and then trying to find those operations in the brain, they started with a set of brain data and inferred the cognitive functions that must have been involved in. So how did this work? Well, first of all, this region or this network of brain activity is called the default network. And it's called the default network because the activity in this area seems to involve default brain function. That is, when the subject is not engaged in a particular task, this set of brain regions are what light up. Okay, so how do we know this? Well, in the early days of neuroimaging, primarily when people were doing PET studies and then with some of the first fMRI studies, what the researchers would do is ask subjects to do one of two things. They would first be involved in an experimental condition. Say it was a memory experiment, and they say, all right, we'd like you to memorize all these words, and we're going to measure your brain activity. And then they would want a resting baseline condition, one where they would just say, sit there and lie still in the scanner and think about nothing. And so that's how they used to collect the data in the early days of neuroimaging. Maybe that sounds like a decent way to go about it, but think about it. One problem here is the control baseline condition where the subject is asked to lie there and do nothing. When do humans lie there and do nothing? Well, let's see, basically never. Right? We never are lying there and doing it. Even when you're sleeping, of course. You're dreaming or you're consolidating memories. Your brain, there's always activity going on in your brain. Your brain simply does not sleep. It goes through different states of activity that are associated with sleep, but it certainly doesn't shut down. Okay? So, in truth, a human being can never just lie there and do nothing. Even if you see no overt movement of the body, of course, there are things going on in the mind. And you think about it, what are you likely to be thinking about when you're just sitting there doing nothing? Well, I'm kind of hungry now. Wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. Maybe I'll stop by the pizza place and bring some pizza home. And then I probably need to work on tomorrow's lecture, so I'll do that this evening. And then, but wait, I got my mom coming in. When am I going to get her for her birthday? And boy, she sure gets upset with me when I don't get. So when you're not really thinking about things, when you're not really engaged in a specific task, you tend to by default think about yourself and the goings-ons in your life. What kind of activities are going on? What kind of things do you need to do in the future? And then remembering things that happened in the past, maybe the very recent past or the distant past. When we are sitting there not engaged in a task, we tend to think about ourselves. Okay? Well, what they were finding in the scanner was that all of their subjects, when they were in this resting baseline condition, they would have activation primarily in two regions. And the first we can see here at the bottom image of the brain. By the way, this brain looks a little weird, right? But it's just a certain way of displaying the brain surface. But at any rate, if you look at the bottom to the right of that brain, you see the medial prefrontal cortex. And if you look on the opposite side of that brain, you see the medial parietal / posterior cingulate brain. These are the two regions that were just lighting up in every baseline condition that all these different researchers were running. And they're baffled. Their feeling was that they would have no activity, essentially. I mean, they knew the brain was not shut off, but they didn't think there'd be any organized activity during that. But it turns out there was organized activity. It was always in these two regions. And so the researchers asked themselves, well, what are people likely to be doing when they're lying in the scanner doing nothing? And as we just discussed, what these researchers reasoned was, I wonder if they're thinking about themselves and making plans for their future and reminiscing on their past. If that's the case, then maybe what we're seeing in these resting baseline conditions is a default network. And if the default is to be thinking about the self, then this default network of brain regions must be supporting our awareness of ourselves and our ability to think about ourselves. So you see how this is different than we had in the previous lecture. Here we started with some brain data and inferred cognitive function from that. These two brain regions are apparently involved in the cognitive processes associated with understanding the self. And so this discovery was made really somewhat by surprise. Nobody expected this brain activation in the baseline conditions. But when they found it, they thought about it and realized, okay, well, this kind of makes sense. Maybe these brain regions are associated with self. And since then, experiments have tried to manipulate different of these cognitive operations to identify just how strongly are these brain regions related to self. And the medial prefrontal and the medial parietal / posterior cingulate cortex have time after time in study after study have activated when subjects think about themselves. So we're very confident with those two regions. Two other regions that have popped up since the original proposed default network are what we see up here in the top brain image, the lateral inferior parietal region, and that area lights up in lots of tasks that are related to self, including tasks like episodic memory. And of course, episodic memory is in many ways about the self. And then we look back down at that bottom image, we can see the hippocampus, a rather small blue spot here. It's also been shown to be important for this default network. And hippocampus, of course, is a serious function or a serious structure subserving memory, and so this is likely to do with autobiographical memory. So if we think about this default network, we think about this medial prefrontal and this medial parietal and perhaps even the lateral parietal and hippocampal regions, we can start to ask, well, are there other tasks out there, other cognitive operations that light up these same regions? And in fact, there really is a range of different kinds of tasks that will light up the medial prefrontal and the medial parietal. So take, for example, autobiographical memory up here at the top. If we look at the image on the right side, we're looking at one of these strange brain images, but it's got the medial prefrontal activation is on the right side of that right brain, and the medial parietal is on the left side of that right brain. Okay? And then if we go down to experiments that had subjects try and picture the future, like plan for something, or think about what the world might be like in 10 years from now or something. When you envision the future, you think about yourself in the future, you again get this medial prefrontal and medial parietal. Another thing, theory of mind. This is a really interesting phenomenon. I remember as a graduate student thinking, theory of mind, oh, this is it. This is the theory that explains the mind. Actually, it's not that at all. It actually just refers to the idea that we each have theories of mind about one another. That is, you have a theory that I have a mind. What do you base this theory on? Well, you hear my lectures, and you assume, well, the lectures that the professor was giving must have come from the thoughts that were in his mind. Where else would they have come from? And when I interact with you over email, or when I grade your tests or your assignments, I read what you had to say, and I infer that what you said, or the answers you gave on the test, that these came from your mind. We have theories of mind of each other. Now, not everybody has these. Children don't. Before the age of 4, most children do not really have a strong concept that other people have minds. And in fact, people with autism tend to lack theory of mind. At any rate, well, let me go ahead and give you one example of a theory of mind task. That is, if you're giving somebody a theory of mind test, you say, all right, well, here's a story about Johnny. Johnny takes a bite of chocolate and puts the chocolate back in the cupboard in his kitchen, runs outside to play baseball with his friends. On this hot day, his mother comes into the kitchen, sees the chocolate is starting to melt, and so she puts it in the refrigerator. Later on, Johnny comes back into the kitchen to get another bite of chocolate. Where is Johnny going to look? Will he look in the cupboard, or will he look in the refrigerator? Now, each of us understands and can answer very quickly, oh, he's going to look in the cupboard. Why? Well, because he doesn't realize that his mother moved the chocolate into the refrigerator. Why? How can we do that? Because we have a theory that Johnny has a mind, and we can think about what Johnny's mind is thinking about, what Johnny's mind's beliefs are going to be. Clearly, Johnny's belief is going to be the chocolate's still in the cupboard. He did not know that his mother moved it. But for people who are under the age of 4 or people with autism, they generally have difficulty with this task. They're generally going to say, oh, Johnny's going to look in the refrigerator. Why? Well, they cannot take into account Johnny's perspective. They can't seem to understand that Johnny has a mind, and one of the beliefs in that mind is that the chocolate is in the cupboard. So, sorry to belabor that point, but theory of mind is a quite interesting task, and we might talk a little bit about it in the next module on social neuroscience. But the point here is that when you try and think about other people's thoughts, you again light up this medial prefrontal and medial parietal / posterior cingulate region. Now, what on earth's going on there? Why, when you're thinking about other people, do brain regions related to yourself light up? It seems counterproductive, doesn't it? If I want to think about somebody else, I better dampen the brain regions that help me think about myself. Well, the really fascinating thing, and I hope you find this fascinating, but to me it's one of the greatest revelations in neuroscience, at least recently, which is that when we think about ourselves, we're using a lot of the same brain regions that we use when we think about other people. When we think about other people, we are using a lot of the same brain regions that we use when we think about ourselves. That is, knowing other people is a lot like knowing ourselves. Again, let me say it this way. The way our brain enables us to figure out what other people are thinking is very similar to the way our brains allow us to figure out what we are thinking. Yeah, that's right. We have to figure out what we think. We don't actually know just right off the bat what our thoughts and our beliefs and our feelings and our desires are. Generally, we have to think about it. Some things come to us very quickly, but lots of things, like when somebody asks you your political opinion about some complex political question, you've got to think about it for a while. Or when somebody says, well, that guy was really rude to you the other day. How do you feel about that? Perhaps you say, oh, I hate the guy and I want to kick his butt. Or perhaps you say, well, I'm not sure. I'm trying to decide whether this guy has mental problems or what have you. It takes us time to figure out how we feel and what we think and what we believe, much as it takes us time to think about or figure out how other people feel or what they believe or what they think. And so it's really quite appropriate, when you think about it, that theory of mind tasks activate self-brain regions. That is, when you try and figure out what other people are thinking, you end up using the same brain regions that you use when you think about what you are thinking. Okay. So anyway, I've gone long enough on this slide, but I hope, as I say, you find this to be one of the more fascinating aspects of the self and how the brain gives rise to it. Now that we've talked about some brain regions involved in being aware of the self, such as the default network, sometimes referred to as the cortical midline structure, which included the medial prefrontal and the medial parietal / posterior cingulate, and also we discussed the hippocampus and the lateral parietal regions. Now let's bring the mirror neuron system into the fold. The mirror neuron system we discussed previously, only in brevity. And the mirror neuron system contains neurons that have what some people call vicarious traits to them. That is, they behave vicariously. What do we mean by that? Well, in the motor system, for instance, there are some neurons that enable you, say, to pick up a cup to take a drink. So those neurons will fire when you pick up the cup to take a drink. But the curious thing is those neurons will also fire when you watch someone else pick up the cup to take a drink. So these neurons not only fire when you move, but they fire when other people move. And the way they fire is specific to the kind of action that's being performed. That is, neurons that fire to either you drinking out of the cup or watching somebody else drink out of the cup will not fire when you put the cup in the sink or when somebody else puts the cup in the sink. So these neurons are believed to be involved in understanding actions. So they help us understand the actions of other people by mirroring their actions, but also our understanding our own actions is a function of our own mirror neuron system. So in that respect, they are involved in our sense of self-awareness and self-perception. They're involved in that part of us that kind of determines why we behave the way we do. We tend to observe our own actions and then explain why we performed those actions. What were we thinking, or what did we feel that caused us to perform those actions? If you wave hello to someone, you observe yourself doing that, so, well, I'm greeting them. You understand your actions because of these mirror neurons. And in this other region, the default network, or some of these cortical midline structures that we've already discussed, we can look at them as being involved in understanding mental states. So again, the mirror neuron system may be involved in self-awareness in terms of us being aware of our own actions, and the default network may be involved in self-awareness in terms of the thoughts that our own thoughts. So for instance, as I said, people who are lying in the scanner during a control baseline period and told to do nothing, were probably thinking about what they wanted to have for dinner, or thinking about when they were going to study for a test or graduate from college or so forth. So they tend to have thoughts about their lives. So the default network presumably involved in understanding mental states of ourselves, whereas the mirror neuron system is involved in understanding our actions. Let's look at some more evidence for the involvement of the mirror neuron system in self-processing and self-awareness. There's evidence that mirror neurons are more excited when you move than when you watch someone else move. Recall, a mirror neuron is oftentimes a motor neuron that not only fires when you move, but it fires also when you watch somebody else move. But the interesting thing is that it will fire more intensely when you move than when you're just simply watching someone else move. And there's an EEG experiment that showed more mirror neuron activation to the self than to observing other people. And this study was looking at the strength of the mirror neuron signal when people were observing others versus performing the action themselves. And what we can see over here on the left side of this bar chart is the first line from the left is, what is that? It's about between 0.10 and 0.20. It's about negative 0.15. And if we look at the bar next to it, it goes down to about negative 0.27, I'm going to say. This first bar represents the mirror neuron activity as recorded by EEG when a subject watched someone else perform an action. And the second bar is the EEG activity when that subject performed that same action themselves. And we can see that the second bar, the one for the self performing the action, is larger than the bar for the self watching another person perform that action. So we can see the second bar is larger than the first bar, indicating that when you perform an action yourself, your mirror neuron system is more active than it is when you're watching somebody else perform that action. And this is consistent with the Now that we've discussed several of the brain regions that are implicated in self-processing, in self-awareness, in self-perception, now let's take a little bit of a science fiction, or maybe a neuroscience fiction turn, and talk about ways that we might improve upon some of those brain regions that are giving rise to the self. Let's see what happens when we start to change out some of our body parts for technological superior ones, and see what happens to the sense of self. Now, I say this is science fiction or neuroscience fiction, but that's not necessarily an accurate description of it. That is, what I'm getting ready to talk about now is what some people believe is absolutely is our future, and in fact is our very near future. So near, in fact, that some people would say that by 2045, many of us will be trading out perfectly good biological body parts for superior technological parts. By 2045, many of us will be trading out perfectly good biological body parts for superior technological ones. There are some very smart people out there who think this is what is going to happen very soon. One of those people is Ray Kurzweil. So he says the implications of this include the merger of biological and non-biological intelligence, immortal software-based humans, and ultra-high levels of intelligence. So essentially what people like Ray Kurzweil are saying is that it is inevitable that we are going to integrate machinery directly into our bodies. That the kind of technology we use today, like computer laptops and cell phones and iPads and so forth, that the utility of those
tools is limited by the fact, or by the way that we interface with them. The laptop, we interface with a keyboard. With iPad, we have this dynamic display, but it's all very much, there's the machine and there's you, and you're trying to figure out how to manipulate and operate that machine as efficiently as possible. Well, if you could somehow hook that machinery straight up to your brain, then you could surely operate it in a much more efficient manner. And that's what Kurzweil and others are suggesting will happen, is that we will begin to integrate this machinery directly into our bodies, directly into our brains. So I want to discuss this a little bit, and I will say for my own part, I don't know if Kurzweil and others like him are right. I suspect they are right, actually. I don't know if the time scale is quite right, though. By 2045, will most of us be mostly machinery and with very little, if any, biology? Well, that's kind of hard to believe, and that's not very far away. But it does seem inevitable that we will, at some point, start to integrate machinery straight into our bodies. So I'm going to try and convince you that is an inevitability, and kind of give you some of Kurzweil's argumentations to why he thinks that will happen soon. And the whole thing I'd like you to keep in mind throughout this discussion on cybernetics and neuroscience fiction, I'd like you to keep in mind, what bearing does this discussion have on the concept of self-identity and how it relates to the body? That is the person you are critically dependent on the body that you're in, or could you radically alter or even substitute that body with some other kind of machinery without losing your sense of self? Could you, in fact, start to take out parts of your body, say like your arms or your legs, perhaps some organs like your heart, or maybe even parts of your brain, actually start to take out biological parts and replace it with machinery that is intended to do what the old biological part did and then some? So, can this process occur without you losing who you are, your self-identity? Just to point out that some people view this technological evolution as an outgrowth or a continuation of biological evolution. This is really quite an interesting concept. There traditionally have been considered two kingdoms in biology. There's been the animal and the plant kingdom. But as of recent, it's become commonly agreed by most biologists that there are at least 6 kingdoms. Not only do we have the animal and the plant, but we've got bacteria, archaebacteria, protozoa, fungi. There's 4. Yeah, and then the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. So there would be 6 kingdoms according to biology, and some people are starting to propose that we add a 7th kingdom, and that kingdom be called technology. That is, they're arguing that technology is essentially biological. It certainly is evolutionary, right? We know that when there's a new technological invention, that technological invention eventually helps us invent even more technological inventions. So, as such, technology is considered to evolve over time. It improves upon itself in very much the same way that genetic evolution occurs. The only difference is technological evolution seems to happen in a much shorter time scale than biological evolution. And so, first thing I'm trying to do away with here is the kind of predisposition most people have to viewing technological as devoid of life and kind of repulsive in that respect. Well, some people are actually starting to consider it a form of life. Now, if you're thinking, well, this is all rather out there, why are we even considering the impossibility of integrating machinery directly into our biological bodies? Well, because it's already being done. For instance, if you look on Vista, you have access to one video. I believe it's called Monkey Robotic Arm, and this is a video of a monkey controlling a robotic arm. He's actually feeding himself with his robotic arm. The truly fascinating thing is that he's not using something like a joystick with his hands to operate this robotic arm. he is using his brain. He has electrodes implanted directly into his motor cortex. Those electrodes feed signals into a computer. That computer converts the electrical signals into motor commands for the robotic arm and sends those commands to the arm. So after about 14 hours worth of training with this arm, the monkey is able to completely feed himself simply by thinking about feeding himself. He simply thinks, grab the marshmallow and bring it to my mouth, and that's what the robotic arm does. It's really quite amazing. And in fact, this video that I have on Vista is by now is a good 3 or 4 years old at least. Each year, these labs, in particular the lab here at University of Pittsburgh, that made this particular robotic arm, each year they're just making exponential gains in the sophistication of these robotic arms and the interface with the motor cortex of these monkeys. It's really quite fascinating, and you can imagine the possibilities this offers for people who've had arms amputated or otherwise paralyzed. This really has great implications for helping improve their quality of life. So I show you this, one, because it tells you, look, the motor commands in your motor cortex are just electrical signals. That's all they are. They're not some strange, mysterious, non-physical kind of intention. They are just electrical signals in the brain. And since they are electrical, we can route those electrical signals outside the brain into a computer and ultimately into a robotic arm. This age of integrating machinery directly into our bodies is already here. It's not commonly used yet, but again, people like Ray Kurzweil suggest that it will be commonly used quite soon. So why might we use it? Well, as I mentioned, some people who have certain kinds of disabilities could certainly benefit from it. One such person would be Oscar Pistorius. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's an elite runner, and the only problem is he has no feet. He has no femurs. Actually, he was born without femurs. You can see on the left here when he was an infant, had no legs. Well, modern prosthetics have really gotten truly sophisticated and capable. So you see over here on the right, Oscar Pistorius is wearing cheetahs. That's the name of these particular running prosthetics he has, and they really do quite an amazing job. These pictures, I believe, are linked to YouTube videos. So you can try just clicking on the picture, and hopefully it will open up YouTube video. That'll probably cause the narration here to stop. Otherwise, you could exit PowerPoint, open up a web browser, go to YouTube, and just do a search for Oscar Pistorius, and I'm sure you can find some very interesting videos on there about him. So he's a young adult who is trying to be a professional runner, and he's raced in many national, international, world events, and was even trying to race in the 2008 Beijing Olympics, but there was a lot of controversy about it. The Olympic Committee did not want to let him try out for the Olympics because they actually believed that his legs gave him an unfair advantage, that there was so much spring in the legs that he would be able to outrun the able-bodied runners because his legs were technologically superior to theirs. So we are already at a point in human history where we can build objects and machines and prosthetics that actually, at least in some respects, do a better job than the limbs they are intended to replace. That is, the Olympic Committee is concerned that Oscar Pistorius' legs are actually better than biological legs for running, and as such they don't want an unfair advantage. Now, there's all kinds of interesting issues here. You can ask, well, is that really fair? And I think in many respects you might say, well, that's really not fair to exclude him because his legs are too good. I mean, to exclude him is to, in a sense, hold it against him to make him suffer for having been born without femurs, something he had no control over. So if he can get technological legs that enable him to run, why not? Well, people say, well, but it's not fair, though, for him to have this unfair advantage, if indeed they do. Of course, you'll see in the videos that he doesn't believe they are any giving. He doesn't believe the legs give him any advantage over traditional biological legs. But even if they do, is that fair to let him out? Well, again, here we have people that are already integrating technological prosthetics into their body that are better in many respects than the limbs they were intended to replace. And I'd like you to consider something. I mean, if you believe that Oscar Pistorius should be excluded from the Olympics, which, by the way, they were ultimately ruled that he could try out for the Olympics, and I can't remember exactly. I believe he just didn't quite qualify for them. So, but you think about what an athlete is, and clearly having a strong body for most athletics is very important. But that's just part of it. I would argue that even more important than having, say, strong legs or strong arms or a strong core for most athletics, the number one most important thing is what's going on in your mind. You've got to have a strong mind. In fact, to compete at the highest levels of professional sports, then you've got to have a highly competitive mind. You've got to have a strong will and desire to succeed, to be the fastest or the strongest or the quickest or what have you. So somebody like Oscar Pistorius, who does win some international competitions against able-bodied runners, he clearly must have this mental drive to be an athlete. And that's great. I know for myself, I don't have that kind of athletic drive, and there's some sports I love to play, but I would never be good at them, at least not at a professional level, because I don't have that mental attitude. I don't have that drive to compete that we see in the truly excellent professional athletes. Oscar Pistorius apparently does. And what a shame it would be if he didn't have these prosthetic legs in order to help him express his athletic mind. If you take Usain Bolt, who won all these gold medals in the 2008 Beijing Olympics, what a lucky guy. Not only is he lucky to have that mental capacity that enables him to see, but to have the body that can help him express his mind's athletic prowess. That's great for him. But what about people who don't have that? Well, is it really fair that you don't have that? Well, no, it's not fair, but hey, it's the way nature worked out. Usain Bolt got that body, I didn't. Well, but if I could buy that body, is there really anything wrong with that? If I could equip myself with the limbs that I needed in order to run that fast, in order to satisfy my athletic mind, wouldn't it be a good thing for me to do so? So I suspect that these prosthetics are going to become most common, first off, in athletics. Probably also in military applications, although we may not hear about those so much because those tend to remain kind of top secret. But certainly in athletics, I think we'll start to see these kind of prosthetics creep in. And once our heroes, our idols, the athletes start to adopt some of these technologies, I think those of us in the lay public will start to consider it too. And what do I say? Adopt these technologies. I mean, there may be a point not too far off at all where people actually will elect to get rid of a perfectly good biological arm, or say leg in the case of a runner, in order to have that leg replaced with a prosthetic that does everything that the old leg did and more. That is, it's every bit as good as the biological leg and better. And if that's the case, if you can actually get that kind of technology, then is there actually any good reason not to go ahead and adopt that technology? And I'm sure many of you are sitting here saying, well, yeah, there's a good reason. Most people their initial reaction is to think this sounds awful. I can't fathom a world where people get rid of good biology to replace it with superior technology. But this may just be prejudice on our part. I always like to point out how I was in the early 90s when cell phones first really started becoming common. I remember thinking how pompous people that carried cell phones were, thinking that what conversation is so incredibly important that they can't wait to get home to call that person. Why are they so important they have to walk down the street using the cell phone? And of course, here we are almost 20 years later, and everybody has cell phones, and people are talking on cell phones constantly as they walk down the street. And I remember thinking, well, I'll never get one of those. That's ridiculous. I'm not so self-important that I think I need one. But then one day my wife comes home, honey, I got you a cell phone. I'm like, what? I don't need a cell phone. Um, but I went ahead and took it. He said, just for emergency purposes. And sure enough, after a few months, I started finding this thing awfully convenient, and then I couldn't live without it. And now we're doing texting, and we've got apps on our phones. It's just, I'm using it as much as anybody else at a time when I said I never would. Now, that's a little bit different than cutting off a body part and replacing it with some technology, but I suggest that ultimately it's a similar concept, that at first the idea sounds obnoxious to us, but over time, as we start to see the benefits that we will gain from adopting this technology, we may start to change our attitudes about it and not have such a repulsive instant reaction to it.
In a further attempt to convince you that the time is not very far off at all when we will begin to integrate machinery directly into our bodies, I point to a case of some of the most recent prosthetic arms used for humans, for disabled humans. Here we have a image from a video on YouTube, and again, hopefully clicking on the image will take you to the link you to the YouTube video. But we see here a gentleman who lost both of his arms in when he was working on electrical power lines, and a bolt went through him and caused him to lose his arms. And he has on his forearm, on his right arm, you can't really see it very well, he's got the traditional prosthetic arm, which is basically just a hook with two digits that you can just open and close. On his left side, he's got what he describes himself as the future of prosthetics. This is a truly magnificent prosthetic arm. It's got, the hand has 5 digits, and it can move just like your wrist can move, and the rest of the body has joints that allow movement that is just like what we see in the human arm. Now the question is, how is he controlling this? There are lots of degrees of freedom here, multiple fingers that can move in multiple different ways. Well, what they did for this gentleman is take nerves that used to be going into his left arm. They're no longer going to that left arm because the left arm's gone, but the nerves are still there. The severed nerves are still in his trunk, in his shoulders, and coming out from his brain. So what they decided to do was take those nerves and innervate them with 4 different muscles in his chest. That is, they took 4 different nerves and integrated each one into its own muscle in the chest. So what happens at that point is, if this is a nerve that used to be going to this gentleman's thumb when the thumb was there, now if he thinks about moving his thumb, it will cause one of the muscles in his chest to twitch. Why? Because the nerve that is leaving the part of the brain that tells him to move his thumb is no longer going out to the, because again the thumb's not there. That nerve is now exciting muscle tissue in his chest. So if he thinks about moving his thumb, it causes the movement of that chest muscle. And I believe there are 3 other muscles that have 3 other nerves innervating each one of them. And so now what they do is, now that you've got 4 different nerves controlling 4 different muscles in the chest, you can now put electrodes on each of those muscles of the chest. And so when you activate, say if he thinks of moving his thumb, then he moves this one, it ends up moving this one muscle in his chest. If it moves that one muscle in his chest, then the electrode that's on that muscle will pick up that signal. Now that electrode is attached to the prosthetic arm. So when that electrode picks up the movement of the muscle, then it will cause the movement of the thumb in that prosthetic arm. So think about that. This gentleman thought about moving his thumb. It caused a twitch in his chest. The twitch in the chest got picked up by an electrode, which was hooked to the thumb actuator. And so when that electrode is active, it activates the thumb actuator, and the thumb moves. So what they have succeeded in doing for this man is transferring his thought from his brain to his chest to the neuroprosthetic. He can drive this prosthetic arm with his thoughts. We're already here, folks. We're already at a point where we can drive machinery directly through our thoughts. And again, you say, okay, well, fine. So people who have lost an arm, this is a great thing for them, but why would someone who had a perfectly good arm, an able-bodied individual, opt for such a prosthetic? Well, surely no one would opt for this prosthetic. It's as remarkable as it is, it's still not nearly as good as having a regular old biological arm. But give it time. Development of these kind of prosthetics has only been going on for 10 or 20 years now. Give us another 10 or 20 years and see what we can do. Heck, give us another 50 or another 100 years, or if you want, another 500 years. You choose the time frame, but in short enough time, these prosthetics are going to be able to do everything a biological arm can do and more. It'll be every bit as agile and more agile. It'll be every bit as strong and more strong. It'll be every bit as accurate and more accurate. And so it's at that point when these technological arms just simply outperform any biological arm that exists, that's when people, I believe, are going to start to contemplate the possibility of elective amputation, where you choose to have a perfectly good biological arm amputated in order to replace it with a technologically superior arm. So let's follow that logic out. If we start replacing, say, arms and legs, then the energy demands are going to increase. That is, if the arms and legs do more, then they're probably going to require more energy. So will your cardiovascular system be capable of delivering the energy those prosthetics need? Well, perhaps not. So maybe you want to start replacing out parts of your cardiovascular system. Let's replace the heart. We already have prosthetic hearts, fully self-contained prosthetic hearts. Granted, they're not prosthetic hearts that you would want to have. It's a last resort if your biological heart just fails. But again, eventually, it's conceivable that these prosthetic hearts will actually be better than biological hearts. They may be able to deliver more blood or help pump more energy. And same for your lungs. Your lungs are great, but if you're making more energy demands on them, then you probably need to augment them or replace them, in fact, with technologically superior lungs, prosthetic lungs. And so the idea here is that we might start replacing out many of our body parts, not just limbs, but internal organs. And eventually, you're going to want to upgrade your brain, essentially. Think about your visual system. Boy, it'd be nice to be able to see in infrared vision, to see thermal imaging, to see X-ray. Ooh, right? It's great. Our visual systems we have now are wonderful, and I love having mine. I'm sure you love having yours as well. But there's no reason to believe that there couldn't be a better visual system out there. There's no reason to believe we couldn't engineer a visual system that's better than the one that's in our heads. And frankly, when that one comes along, I don't see why I wouldn't take it. It's probably going to be expensive. Probably won't have enough money, but that's a different set of issues. And I often like to think about or try and convince students that ESP is real. Now, I don't believe in ESP so much in the traditional sense. I've seen no evidence that extrasensory perception is actually occurring. Actually, sorry, let me change that. It's not actually so much ESP per se. I'm thinking more of telepathy. I can't seem to say it. That is where we communicate with each other without using words or sign language or anything. We just think, and we can hear each other's thoughts. I don't think this is happening yet, but I think it will in the perhaps relatively near future. How so? Well, we just think of your cell phone. If you take the earpiece of your cell phone and plant that into the primary auditory cortex or to the auditory brainstem, and so you have these cellular signals coming through the air, and they're received by this Bluetooth device that's implanted in your primary auditory cortex. So instead of having the signal picked up by a device outside your body that routes it through a speaker that can then go into your ear and into your brain, forget the whole ear, and forget forget having a cell phone outside your body. Put the whole earpiece inside your brain, so that the signals can just go through your skull into the Bluetooth device and stimulate your auditory cortex directly. And then for the other side of your cell phone, the microphone, let's go to Broca's area. Let's implant this device into Broca's area to where it can read the electrical signals in Broca's area, which are the words that you want to speak. It can decode those electrical signals and then send them wirelessly through the air to someone else's earpiece that's implanted in their auditory cortex. So now you can both hear what somebody else is saying, even if you, well, let me think of a way to put this. You can register what they're saying. It goes straight to your auditory cortex without sound waves ever hitting your ear, without having to see that person or otherwise being close enough to hear them. And how are they communicating the words to you? By just thinking of the words with Broca's area, and this Bluetooth device will translate that electrical signal into a cellular signal and send it to your earpiece. So, to think about it from the first-person perspective, I could sit here and have a conversation with you. If we both had these implants, we could have a full conversation without ever moving our mouths, without ever moving our eyes or our hands or any part of our body. We could simply transmit our thoughts cellularly or wirelessly through the air to one another. And that, my friends, is effectively telepathy. Again, it doesn't exist yet, but I don't see why sometime in the perhaps not so distant future that this kind of thing will occur. And so, let's think about the timeline. Again, Ray Kurzweil says that all these kind of fantastical human-machine integrations that I'm talking about here, that he says these are going to happen by the year 2045. Folks, that's only 2 or 3 decades away. Is that really possible that it could happen that quickly? And of course, for most of us, if we even accept what I'm saying here, that humans will start to integrate machinery into their bodies, even if you accept that, I think most people find it very hard to believe that we're going to see that happening by the year 2045, within about 20 to 30 years from now. But Kurzweil has an argument in his favor. He says, well, why do we believe that 2045 is too soon for this to happen? Well, because when we try and predict how much technological advance humans will make in the future, we look to the past. And when we look to the past, we see some of these landmarks of human technological innovation. We see fire, see invention of the wheel, we go way ahead into invention of the printing press, the train, the computer. Okay, these things took a long time to develop. From the time we developed a computer to go all the way back to when fire was discovered, that must have been over 100,000 years ago. And the wheel also probably over 100,000 years ago. And then the printing press, it wasn't until, I believe the 1800s, and the train and the car in the late 1800s, and then it's another almost 100 years before we got a bona fide usable computer. When we look to the past, technological innovation has happened over 100,000 years or more in humanity. And so we think, well, we're going to predict out. We're going to say, well, any advance we make in the future is going to follow this same linear trend. So it's going to take quite a while for us to get to the point to where we have nanotechnology, before we have the merger of humans and machines, and before we have this idea, which I haven't really discussed, but the idea of humans that are software-based. Perhaps your consciousness is really living on a machine, a giant computer network or something. So, again, most of us, we look to the past, we see how fast, or rather how slowly technological innovation occurred, and we assume that technological innovation is going to occur at that same pace. But Kurzweil says, well, no, wait a minute, there's a problem we're making here. The curve that describes technological innovation is not actually a linear curve, he says. It's an exponential curve. And so if we look at where we are right now, around the time of computers, and we look back, the function looks approximately linear. That is, this purple line looks pretty much like a straight line. But what we're unable to see is that we're on the elbow of this curve, and that we're very soon going to start making exponential gains in our technological advancements. In fact, Kurzweil argues that these have been exponential gains all the while. Indeed, if you really want to get sophisticated about it, he says that even the exponent itself is increasing exponentially. So the idea is that in these next few decades, our technological innovation is going to occur at a mind-boggling pace, one that we would never be able to predict by looking at the rate of technological growth prior to this point in time. So finally, as one more attempt to try and convince you of the feasibility of integrating biology and machinery, I'll refer you to another video. This image again is linked to a video on YouTube, and this is a video of a little rat or a little robot. I believe it's called Ratbot. Why is it called Ratbot? Well, the robot itself is not made to look or necessarily behave that much like a rat, but the computer that effectively drives this robot is a slice of brain tissue from a rat brain. In this case, they took a slice of living rat brain tissue and managed to keep it alive for a few days, and then they were able to actually hook electrodes to this slice of tissue. And this slice of tissue was given input from the robot. That is, it was given some sensory input, like it was able to respond to light, and also it could feel when it ran into a wall. And with a little bit of training, this slice of rat brain tissue learned how to control the robot and direct it around the room. So that's also a truly phenomenal process. That is, the tissue in our brain can fundamentally drive machinery. So we know this can be done. It's just a question of whether it will be done. So again, check this video out. It's a very interesting one.